Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Kelsey Prihota, and I am the Great Lakes Transportation Extension Educator with Minnesota Sea Grant. Minnesota Sea Grant is the lead organization for the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network. Our network is a binational collaborative of specialists from the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, Hudson River, and St. Lawrence River regions focused on reducing risks associated with multiple modes of oil and other hazardous material transportation. The collaborative is committed to the dissemination of accurate, neutral, and data-driven information through education, outreach, and relationship building in order to improve public safety, the region's economy, and environmental stewardship of our water resources. To that end, we are thrilled to bring you this first webinar in our 2022 summer webinar series. These webinars will be taking place monthly through September. Today's panel webinar, entitled Fueling the Laurentian Great Lakes Region, Multiple Modes, Multiple Perspectives, will provide background on multimodal crude oil transport pathways, the regional energy economy, environmental impacts of crude oil transportation, and social dimensions of oil movement and spills. The next webinar in our series will take place on Wednesday, July 20th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern, and will be focused on tribal policy and treaty law as it applies to the transport of hazardous materials through and near tribal lands and waters. Registration for the July webinar will open soon. So before we get started, I have a few logistics to share with you. The first is that this webinar is being recorded. The recording with closed captioning will be made publicly available on Minnesota Sea Grant's YouTube and on the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network's website. We invite you to submit questions, comments, and/or let us know about technical challenges at any time via the question and answer box in your Zoom toolbar. We will be collecting those questions for the question and answer session that will take place following the 4 panel presentations. So it is my pleasure now to introduce you to the first of 4 panel presenters. Dr. Richard Stewart is Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Superior's Department of Transportation and Logistics and is the Director of the Transportation and Logistics Research Center. From 1969 to 1986, Dr. Stewart served aboard and commanded product, chemical, and crude oil tankers. Dr. Stewart was in the U.S. Naval Reserve from 1973 to 2003, earning the rank of captain and specializing in the merchant marine naval interface, naval logistics, transportation of hazardous cargo, and port operations. From 1979 to 2022, he held an unlimited Ocean Master license, enabling him to command any merchant ship in the world. From 1986 to 87, Dr. Stewart managed a fleet of 7 ocean-going vessels, 4 of which were tankers. Prior to his appointment at University of Wisconsin-Superior in 1999, he was a professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy for 13 years and head of their Department of Marine Transportation. Dr. Stewart's research has been focused on marine, intermodal, rail, planning, and logistics issues. Dr. Stewart has also been trained in oil spill and response. And today, Dr. Stewart will be presenting to us oil transportation in the Great Lakes Basin. And again, as a reminder, there will be a Q&A session after all 4 presentations, but you can please type your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom toolbar at any time. And also please indicate which panel member the question is directed to. The floor is yours, Dr. Stewart.
Thank you very much, and it's a delight to be part of the panel here. I was asked to speak about oil transportation in the Great Lakes Basin. I see in the introduction we're covering the Hudson River. I've transported oil up and down the Hudson and into the St. Lawrence Seaway also. So if we have questions about those, I'll be delighted to answer them. In the world of transportation, whenever we talk about movement of a product, we want to first find out information about that product because that will drive the types of transportation, the vehicles, the logistics that we do it with. So let's take a look at, why are we, there we go. Crude oil. Crude oil industry designations, you've got crude with a high sulfur and carbon content is typically called sour. It has a lot of hydrogen sulfide, can be quite toxic. If we have a low amount of sulfur and carbon, it's a sweet type of oil. Lighter and sweeter the oil, the more expensive it's going to be. And I give a little graph there on the left-hand side, gives you an idea of sweetness and sour crudes. We measure typically by density. A denser crude oil in a tank car, a vessel, whatever mode of transportation you're using, you're going to carry less volume because it'll mass out first. And then we're very concerned about the total acid number, the TAN. That's the corrosion that is inherent in that particular type of crude oil. And I personally have been aboard a ship that in the course of 6 months into steel plating had 1/4 inch pitting from a high TAN level crude. So we get very concerned about that in terms of the types of crude we're going to carry. On the right-hand side is a graph. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bakken and Canadian crude and how they fit into there. Typically, we're moving West Texas type of crude or Louisiana light crude or the crude out of the Gulf, which is called Mars, up to our region, though we do bring in a variety of crudes through the St. Lawrence Seaway to Montreal. Canadian crude oils, red is tar sand oils, and I'm only giving a couple examples here because I only have limited time. Green is what is typically delivered to Superior, Wisconsin through the Enbridge Line 3 system. They also do bring in some tar sands, but a lot of the tar sands is Keystone and others. And that just gives you a comparison between West Texas Intermediate crude, which is a light sweet crude, versus, as you could see, the lower the API number, the denser it is. These are dense, high sulfur, fairly acidic, and in the case of Peace River, heavy, quite acidic types of crude oil that are being brought into the Great Lakes Basin area. And if you remember from the first slide, if we're concerned about water pollution, the basin is really defined by the watershed where any spills will flow into the Great Lakes region. Bakken crude is considered a light sweet crude, very close to West Texas Intermediate crude, almost identical on the safety data sheets we use in looking at products. Now, the EPA also has crude oil classifications. We don't really use them at all in transportation and determining modes, determining construction, anything else, but they are taken into consideration anytime that you have a spill because of the toxicity that will occur and the persistence of the crude oil and the difficulty in cleaning it up. All oil is a hazardous material. In the United States, the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration has oversight of oil transportation. We then regulate it under the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, Title 49. One of the things we need to understand is that nobody can transmit hazardous material, including preparing paperwork for the transportation of hazardous material, unless they've been through a course and are certified and maintain that certification. So this is not, it's taken very seriously by the transportation industry and by the regulators. And we move probably 1 trillion tons a year of hazardous materials in the United States. Additional federal and state regulations may apply, and certainly for tank farms, terminals, pumping stations, and personnel. Now, on the marine side, the U.S. Coast Guard regulates marine personnel and vessel construction for anything moving oil transportation. Typically on the Great Lakes, you'll involve, including the Coast Guard, about 23 different state and federal agencies in the regulation of the movement of vessels. So let's talk a little bit about the impacts on transportation systems of crude oil. If you have sweet or sour crude, you're very concerned about toxic gas containment systems, fire suppression systems that you need to have. And water won't work. You're going to have foam, aqueous foam, or which can in itself be toxic. In some cases, carbon dioxide will work, and everybody who's involved in it has had training in firefighting in the marine industry. Density, as I mentioned, a low API number means more mass per volumetric measure. We typically talk about petroleum in terms of volumetric measure, gallons and barrels. In industry, we're concerned about that. We're also concerned about density. And I mentioned the fact that you may need thicker or even stainless steel components if you have a high TAN number. You also have a problem with waxy crude. Crude oil can have high wax contents. When it does, it's difficult to clean up, which means that interchanging tank cars or anything else can be expensive and sometimes really not feasible, which leads to the big point that transportation systems, whatever mode they are, will be built to product specifications and may not be interchangeable. So the type of tank car that you're using to carry a sour crude, you can't automatically switch it to a sweet crude. You may have to do a very expensive cleaning operation in containment and proper disposal of that cleaning. This is especially true in the marine field. I want to talk a little bit about refineries because the transportation of crude is typically by a transportation system to a refinery. Now, there is some truck transportation in the Bakken fields. I'm going out there actually to the fields on Friday. And you do get some truck transport, but that's quite uncommon. Most refineries are built to handle one, sometimes two types of crude oil. Changing to a sweet or sour and can be very difficult and very expensive sometimes. Your transportation system that serves a terminal has to have highway, rail access, pipeline, right-of-ways, whatever's necessary, and loading and unloading facilities that are all approved for this process. In the materials management side, the crude refineries require a constant flow of crude oil and other products. It's not just a crude that comes in. And they're going to need to have some storage available because shutting down a refinery is a very expensive and difficult operation, both to shut it down and start it back up again. So if there is a hiccup in the supply chain, they need to have some buffer stocks. So they will have some tank farms at the refinery for both the finished product and the crude oil coming in. On the right-hand side, I just give you a little idea of what you get out of a barrel of crude oil. And typically, if you have a 42-gallon, which is the standard for a barrel, you actually get about 45 gallons of product after refining, and that's because as you refine them, they become less dense and you have a greater volumetric measure that's taking place with it. So what's the objective of crude oil pipeline transportation? Move the crude from the source to the refineries. Comes in from oil fields in our region, from Canada, Dakotas, Texas, Louisiana, can come overseas. You need to understand that crude as a commodity is bought and sold while it's in the pipeline, the entire time it's moving. Most pipeline companies don't own the crude oil. They provide a high volume transportation service. There'll be branch lines going to refineries. These branch lines may or may not be owned by the refineries themselves. That varies depending on what you're looking at. You have to have a constant volume flowing through in order to have product separation. You can separate the product with pigs, but typically we do it with laminar flow by keeping a constant pressure. That's also how you tell if there's a leak in the system, is a pressure drop. And it only moves at about 4 miles per hour, but it has to be a constant flow. So you've got to have pumping stations. You've got to have tank farms if you need to flow the crude off, to make a repair, do anything else. And keep in mind that almost always pipelines flow in only one direction. Check valves, other stuff are all set up to move in one direction. You don't reverse the flow on the pipelines. Now, smaller pipelines will service your refined product from the refinery to tank farms serving the retail markets. They may move out by rail cars. We move at the Refinery Superior, we move asphalt out by tank car and by truck. So there are some products that move out and as refined products by tank car and truck, and they also move out by ship too, but they can move out by pipeline. So the crude oil pipelines in the Great Lakes Basin, on the right-hand side, I give a list of where the principal refinery locations are. And you notice some asterisks because there may be more than one refinery in the area. Now, Chicago, Toledo, they get served by oil that comes up from the Gulf, either from the oil fields in Texas or Louisiana, or brought in by ship and from Saudi Arabia and then moved up through the pipeline system. They really don't get any crude delivered to them by vessel on the Great Lakes, but they are in the watershed. Sarnia is getting their oil coming in through the Enbridge pipelines. Left-hand side, I'm sorry. First pipeline was completed in 1949. That's line 3, which they just replaced. So that's a 70-plus-year-old pipeline that they replaced. Originally, it terminated in Superior, and we moved crude and refined products by vessel to lower Great Lakes, but we stopped doing that back in the 80s. Refineries were built to process the Canadian crude oil. Remember, I said that refineries are built to process certain types of crude oil. We've extended that pipeline system and expanded it, and we no longer use the vessels. These are your principal pipeline companies. In some cases, they may own the product. In most cases, they do not. Crude oil transportation by rail, it predates pipeline transportation, actually. The history of it originally moved by barrels on rail cars out of Pennsylvania. Now it typically travels in dedicated cars carrying about 30,000 gallons. Once again, I say roughly because that depends upon the API number of it. It's a one-way transportation. You're not backhauling any product, so that means your shipper pays for return to car to the source of the crude or wherever they're hauling. Time consuming to load and unload. You've got to switch the cars, get them under the loading systems, get them loaded, move out the next car in. Railroads prefer unit trains of typically 100 cars. They'll take a block of 15 for oil transportation. They'll charge significantly higher rates for small lot movements, 1 or 2 cars. And in the US, most railroads, certainly the West Coast railroads and even some of the East Coast railroads, and by west and east, I mean west of the Mississippi or east of the Mississippi, they prefer transportation of crude oil in distances greater than 500 miles. And if you want to do fewer miles, you pay a higher price. Real quick on vessels, most important, if we're going to do crude oil transportation, you've got to have inert gas systems, crude oil washing, A lot of things have to be done. Very expensive to build those ships. We do barges on the Mississippi River with crude oil, none on the Great Lakes. We have integrated tug barges. We have tank ships. This is a product tanker. We don't have crude oil tankers on the Great Lakes. We do have product tankers. So here's some transportation realities, some takeaways. Each mode is interlinked in the system. Carriers, the people who transport the goods, actually move freight, information, and money. They don't get paid until they deliver the product. And so it's very important to them to move the product and provide information so the supply chains run smoothly. In most cases, shippers value reliability over transportation costs. And shippers rarely, if ever, pay extra for environmental benefits that do not save the shipper money. Building a green ship and charging extra for the green ship usually means you lose cargo. And freight, like water, follows the path of least resistance. Physical and regulatory barrier resistance alters the path that it might go. No carrier will build new assets on speculation. They and their financial backers want long-term contracts to build ships, new rail cars, or any other facilities. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. So I want to now welcome our second panelist, Dr. Marcelo Graziano. Dr. Graziano is an associate professor at Southern Connecticut State University's Department of Management and International Business and the associate director of the Connecticut Center for Economic Analysis at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Graziano is an economic geographer whose research interests include energy geography, sustainable transitions, the blue economy, spatial econometrics, and regional economic modeling. Dr. Graziano was co-author on the 2015 publication, The Economic Impact of Crude Oil Transportation in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Region, a preliminary study prepared for the Great Lakes Commission. Dr. Graziano will be presenting the relationship between crude oil transportation and the blue economy. The floor is yours, Dr. Graziano.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and thank you to all our listeners and viewers today. I'll try to absolutely stay on time. We're going to be talking about the relationship between crude oil transportation and sort of a relatively newer concept for the region and for North America in general, the blue economy. New concept, new regional economic development paradigm that has been emerging quite powerfully over the last 2 years. But first, a little bit of recap. I hope you can see my screen fine. I apologize. I usually have 2 screens, but not today. So what are we talking about? Professor Stewart already gave quite a comprehensive introduction about the transportation of crude oil in the Great Lakes region, the legally defined Great Lakes region, which you see sort of a map here with divisions by county and by census unit for Canada on the other side of the border. What are we talking about when we talk about the economic impact, economic activities that are related to transporting crude oil in the region? Now, first of all, let me say that the Laurentian Great Lakes region of North America is probably not the most famous production site for oil and gas in the world, but it is the beating heart of oil transportation for North America. And literally being almost at the center, at the physical geographical center of North America is where a lot of our crude oil and natural gas passes by. It's pivotal for the transportation and sale of Canadian crude oil, which essentially has one market, for the most part, it has one market for its sales, which is the United States, and also for the re-refining of chemical products. A lot of the crude oil comes in, gets refined, processed, it's part of chemical transformations and re-exported to Canada and nowadays overseas in part, or used or throughout the entire United States. What are we talking about when we talk about transporting crude oil and dealing with crude oil from an economic perspective or regional economic perspective? We're talking about, as of 2016, a little more than 900 firms that operate, and you see the little dots there, most of which are classified as engaging in traditional economic activity, very few ones in high tech, usually related to management and cleanup of hazardous materials. A little more than 30,000 workers in the region, and in 2016 they recorded revenues of about $20 to $24 billion, all considered all together from their activities in the region. We're talking about primarily refineries, pipelines, railways as well, tiny bit of water transportation, as Professor Stewart has indicated. The concentration of these companies occurs primarily in the major urban centers. You see them around here a little bit, the Toronto metro area slightly outside, Detroit and its metro area, and of course Chicago, which technical reasons here is kind of out, but we included in our analysis in 2015, 2016 for the additional counties that are not within the boundaries of the GLR compact, but certainly they benefit from being next to and in proximity to the network of pipelines and the transportation network of crude oil in the region. So in here, briefly, I'll look at what kind of impacts are we talking about, what drives these jobs, and also what has changed from 2016 is the emergence, as I was saying, of the blue economy. So it's transporting crude oil across the region in line with the region's economic development plans. Is that what we want for the region, or what the elected politicians want, what people want? Now, in terms of numbers, we're talking about in the region 2,351 kilometers of crude-only pipelines, with all oil product amounting to a little more than 9,000. You see the number there in the watershed for the crude oil, if we don't limit ourselves to just the watershed, which is the map. So before, and we include the states, all the states that are part of the Great Lakes region. We have about 18,000 kilometers of pipelines. We have almost 50 oil-powered power plants, liquid crossing points, oil product terminals, and so forth. So these are all elements that add to the economic impact, that add jobs to an extent. What do I mean by an extent? When it comes to pipelines, have a characteristics. Nobody likes them, and everybody loves them, in the sense that from an economic perspective, pipelines are efficient. Pipelines don't require massive amount of workers. That's why they're efficient. That's why they can deliver liquids at a lower cost than alternatives. They tend also to have negative environmental impacts, which can be transformed in economic impacts. We did in the report. I sort of didn't include them here because I know another presenter will focus on that. But they have less, unless there is a major issue, their kind of environmental impacts tend to, as someone put it to me, they tend to pss and not boom, meaning that a leak is silent. If it's not huge, like the Kalamazoo River accident, they are almost never reported to the general public. Trains, on the other hand, for example, that transport crude oil and other chemicals, when they have an accident, they tend to explode and make it to the major into the major news outlets. So from a public perception, maybe a little more acceptable. But in terms of jobs, we're talking about little. In fact, the majority of the jobs and the job impacts that we have in the region, we've recorded in the region, came from not from pipelines, pipeline-related businesses in the region. You see it here for US, Canada, and then the Chicago area treated separately. 1,000 people. By the way, 30,000 people, I was saying before, for the entire sector is left in General Motors employees in Michigan alone. But they are high-paying jobs for the most part, particularly when it comes to a different sector that is refineries, which of course require pipelines, or at least they require some form of transportation. So the impact is not huge from a numerical perspective, but certainly these are relatively high-paying jobs when we look at refineries, not pipelines, and they're also fundamental jobs for additional industries that are outside of the purview of transporting crude oils and other hazardous materials. For example, the chemical industry, the chemical cluster that exists, for instance, in Michigan, thanks to DuPont, Dow, Corning, and all that area there. There are major customers for these materials. Now, how does it come into play, all this, with the blue economy? What is the blue economy? Very briefly, is the sustainable use of ocean, but nowadays it's meant as water resources for economic growth. So it is a new way where trying to reach economic sustainability, but also social equity and justice and ecological sustainability. And the blue economy comes into play because the entire region has been making efforts in the past 4 years, the Great Lakes Commission included, to have and develop a blue economy, blue accounting, and to try to seize the opportunities that the blue economy bring into the region. It has the promise, the blue economy as a paradigm to conjugate sustainability with high-paying jobs. This is absolutely not just tourism, which has had its issues as a driver for economic growth in the region. The GLR, on top of that, is unique as a coastal region because as large urban centers, we're talking about fresh water, so there are additional uses compared to the ocean. The traditions also are different in the region. When we look at the blue economy implemented out here where I am in New England, or out west in particular nowadays, or in Alaska, a lot of the old times related to things like commercial fisheries. In the Great Lakes, commercial fisheries were essentially dead by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Many instances when we talk about fisheries of the Great Lakes nowadays, we are talking about charter boats, so something that relates to a completely different value chain, tourism and recreation. The other element there is that the blue economy in the Great Lakes faces a unique challenges because people, in general, the attitude has been that we don't want anything in the water, but we have things in the water. As we have seen from previous presentation, this is a snapshot of Line 5 in north of Michigan. We have cables, we have shipping lanes, we have communication cables, we have had decades of discharges of industrial waste, which fortunately we have limited nowadays. So the question, and I'm conscious of the time, the question is, can we have a blue economy that's really a blue economy, where a lot of these the activities rely, even industrial ones, for example, third generation aquaculture, whether it happens in the Great Lakes or within the basin, anyway, rely on the high quality water. Can this exist, this cohabitate with the transportation of crude oil, with the role of the GLR as a beating heart of the oil and gas industry for at least the eastern portion of the United States? The answer is that we don't know yet, because we are facing policy tipping points at this point. We have had major outbreaks in the past, like the Enbridge oil spill in Michigan and Hudson River, and we may need a change in the actors and the attitudes, the voters first, but also of policymakers. We may see that happening quite fast, however, as we have a deployment of in any form of the Blue Deal, which is sort of a sister paradigm with that goes hand in hand with the Green New Deal, form of Blue New Deal that in reality, despite the labeling, is quite apolitical, because we have seen states ruled by both major parties in the United States, for example, so on this side of the border, implementing some shape or form of these initiatives, particularly when they tackle industrial development such as offshore renewable energy deployment or advanced aquaculture, which tend to create and generate substantial local jobs that remain throughout the years. And the other issue, of course, remains the fact that we are dealing with a region that's rich in fresh water, which carries opportunities, but also, of course, leads us to be more careful because of its uses compared to salt water in the marine regions. Question of the time, and I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end as stipulated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graziano. Welcome to our third panel member, Dr. Michael Murray. Dr. Murray is an instructor at Augusta University's Department of Biological Sciences and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. Dr. Murray is a member of the International Joint Commission Science Advisory Board and is the lead author on the 2018 publication, Potential Ecological Impacts of Crude Oil Transport in the Great Lakes Basin. And that is what Dr. Murray will be presenting on today. As a reminder, there is going to be an opportunity for question and answer after all four presentations. I will ask the panelists, though, in light of maybe a shortened live Q&A, if the panelists could take a look at the questions that are in the Q&A box right now and maybe type answers into the ones where you are able to easily do so, that would be much appreciated. And so, Dr. Murray, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. And I hope that my screen is displaying correctly. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Outreach Network today on this important topic of crude oil, and looking in particular, in my case, at the ecological impacts of crude oil transport in the Great Lakes. This is drawing largely on a project I was involved with the International Joint Commission Science Advisory Board over the past, few years, just trying to now advance my slides. There we go. So for folks, I imagine most folks are aware of the International Joint Commission is the binational body, intergovernmental body that has multiple responsibilities, but in particular advising the US and Canadian federal governments on water quality issues under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And about 5 years or so ago, the commissioners and members of the Science Advisory Board had an interest in looking at energy and implications of energy and energy transport, in particular crude oil, in the Great Lakes region. So we developed a project, we assembled a work group, and then, like so many other IJC projects, we wound up contracting with a group, in this case, Limnotech, that carried out a really in-depth literature review and assessment of the impacts of, basically, ecological impacts of crude oil in the Great Lakes basin, so focusing on freshwater environment. And then the work group that was assembled as part of this process drew on that technical report from Limnotech, developed a work group report that then went to the commissioners, and then that in turn can form the basis for advice of the commissioners to the parties of the Water Quality Agreement. In terms of the overall goal of the project indicated here, basically review and assess the ecological impacts of crude oil in the Great Lakes through consideration of multiple factors, including the various types of unrefined liquid hydrocarbons transported in the region that we just heard about in the previous talks, the fate and behavior of oil, ecological exposures and effects, potentially vulnerable areas in the region. And then we also looked at monitoring, modeling, and oil spill response and ecosystem resiliency. Not going to focus on that today due to limited time, but those are the issues we looked at this report. And also, just to be clear, we did not consider human health impacts or look at refined products. We've already heard from Dr. Stewart on the importance of shipping of refined products versus, say, crude oil on the Great Lakes themselves currently. What we found, and as it already been stated, pipelines are a major transport mode for crude oil to and through the Great Lakes. We don't have really much oil production going on within the region, much if any, especially within the Great Lakes Basin, but there's a lot of crude oil that's coming in, moving through the basin. Some of that's moving all the way through, going back into Canada, or moving through and being processed in refineries, as we heard from Dr. Stewart, including refineries, say, in Detroit, Toledo, Chicago area. And as we also heard from Dr. Stewart, there's been increased production of crude that's relevant to the Great Lakes region because of the increased production in the Canadian oil sands area, as well as the north central US, where we've seen a lot of, in particular, the tight oil production over the past decade really increasing. So when we think about the impact of oil on the ecosystems, on organisms, we need to think about first the source of oil, the type of oil, but also how it's moving around, how its dynamics in the environment. So we have to think about basically the transport and fate. And this is a schematic that LimiTech developed that's kind of a nice schematic summary of the processes going on when oil is spilled in an aquatic ecosystem. Because as we saw from Dr. Stewart, oil is typically less dense than water, so typically floating on the surface if there's a spill on the surface. So we get the surface slicks developing, spreading. If we have more wind and wave turbulence, that can break up the slicks, start to incorporate some of the material down into the water column, and we can get the other processes occurring, the emulsification, we can get degradation, we can get sorption of the oil onto spin a particular matter. And an important process is dissolution, because with oil, we're concerned not just with the bulk oil, but also the components. And oil has really thousands of individual chemical components to it, including the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, that are important contaminants of concern. Also, an important thing to keep in mind is that once you have an oil spill, typically there's a weathering that goes on. So a lot of the oil, the lighter components start to evaporate off. And then that means typically that the remaining oil tends to get denser and eventually get to a point where it's maybe similar density to water and start to sink. And so if you're already starting off with an oil that's relatively denser, as we saw from Dr. Stewart, say with some of the Western Canadian products, then you get more weathering after a spill, like we saw with the Kalamazoo River spill, then you're going to tend to get more sinking of the oil, which makes it that much more challenging to address. So when in reviewing the ecological exposures and effects of crude oil in freshwater, these are just some of the general findings. We're concerned with both the bulk oil, as I mentioned. For example, it can shade out and prevent light from reaching phytoplankton, so they can't carry out photosynthesis. And then there can be the chemical components, such as the PAHs. And there's been a lot of research on both PAHs and alkylated PAHs, in particular in the past decade. And there's concerns with toxicity of a number of these compounds to fish, in particular early life stages that are especially sensitive. Also, diluted bitumen or dilbit was found in a study to affect development in model fish species, including affecting the swim bladder. And birds are at particular risk of oil exposure, including through the ingestion during their preening, grooming processes, and also can be exposed through inhalation. So in terms of the state of knowledge here with freshwater systems, such as the Great Lakes and the different organism groups, this is a high-level summary here from LimiTech. Basically, you can see at the lower food web, we really have less information. There have been some studies on effects to, say, phytoplankton and zooplankton, but in general, the marine species seem to be better studied. For reptiles and amphibians and mammals, we also don't have a lot of information. There were some studies that were done, some follow-up work in the Kalamazoo River spill that was mentioned in 2010, but we really need to do more work in that area. There's better knowledge on fish and birds, and where there's been a lot of work on high-value species in fish, as well as some model organisms that are mainly studied in the lab that are good species to study in terms of, say, toxicity of compounds like PAHs. And then in terms of birds, a lot of more studies on waterfowl and piscivores and gulls. But again, like many of the other groups, there's limited data compared to what we have for marine species. In terms of areas in the Great Lakes that we think are more vulnerable, and this is based on, again, the LimiTech assessment, they looked at really just kind of a high-level vulnerability assessment analysis of areas in the Great Lakes that might be more vulnerable to oil spills, based largely on where we've got the oil transport infrastructure. So you can see the pipelines coming in here, including the Line 5 that comes through Straits of Mackinac that we heard about before. That is going to be a vulnerable area just because of the fact that we have the pipeline there. But also a lot of coastal areas are areas of high productivity, high biodiversity, so vulnerable for that reason as well. It's also where a lot of people live around the Great Lakes, like so many other areas. So we have a lot of other pressures as well as potential impacts of oil spills to think about. And so these coastal coastal environments, coastal habitats are particularly vulnerable, and certain species are particularly vulnerable as well. Walleye, common sportfish, as well as lake sturgeon, which is now a lot of restoration efforts are directed toward, but where those could get interrupted in some areas, say if we have an oil spill in that particular area. In terms of key findings and recommendations from this analysis, we've got a pretty good understanding of crude oil impacts to fish, and the early life stages are particularly sensitive, and relatively good understanding, as I mentioned, to birds with multiple exposure routes of concern, but still a lot more that needs to be done, especially in other species. In general, we have fewer studies on the freshwater species compared to marine species. And again, the Great Lakes coastal habitats are particularly vulnerable to oil spills. We had about 12 recommendations in our report. Don't have time to go into all of them there, but one of the key ones was that we need to have more ecotoxicology research that's done on freshwater species, including species of concern in the Great Lakes. And we need to improve understanding of the species and habitat sensitivity and incorporate that into mapping systems. And so that was, again, one of the recommendations. And actually, it's been good to see that NOAA, in the meantime, since the report came out in 2018, has updated their environmental sensitivity index mapping system for at least parts of the Great Lakes, including Straits of Mackinac, St. Mary's River. So that has been good to see. Just want to acknowledge the co-authors, Dave Allen and Matthew Child, and then John Bratton and the Limotech staff for all of a lot of the heavy lifting on the literature review, and then other work group members. And then the link to the report, 2 reports are there, as well as my contact information. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murray. Really appreciate that presentation. So it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our final panelist, Dr. Liesl Ritchie. Dr. Ritchie is a professor of sociology and associate director of the Center for Coastal Studies at Virginia Tech. During her career, Dr. Ritchie has studied a range of disaster events, including the Exxon Valdez and BP Deepwater Horizon oil spills, the Tennessee Valley Authority coal ash release, Hurricane Katrina, and earthquakes in Haiti and New Zealand. And since 2000, Dr. Ritchie's focus has been on the social impacts of disasters and community resilience. And she has published widely on topics of conducting social impact assessments, social capital, and rural renewable resource communities. And Dr. Ritchie's presentation is titled An Overview of Social Dimensions of Marine Oil Spill. Dr. Ritchie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Greetings from Blacksburg, Virginia. I'd like to say a special hello to my Canadian friends. I'm born and raised there, and I lived in Kalamazoo for a while, so I'm familiar with northern weather, which we are not having here today. It's an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I truly appreciate all of the work that Sea Grant does around the country, and I've had the opportunity to work with a number of offices on the Gulf Coast, up in Alaska, and on the East Coast as well. So I conduct research on the psychosocial stress and sociocultural impacts of technological or human-caused disasters. I've had the unfortunate opportunity, and my slides are not advancing. There we go. To study a number of opportunities to learn from various spill events and hazard and disasters. I worked on the Selendang Ayu oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon, as Kelsey also mentioned. I also do social impact assessment work with First Nations up in Canada. Most well-known is the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline project that was halted, where we did social impact assessment work with the Gitga'at First Nation. Although I have not conducted, and I want to make that clear, any research in your regions, I did poke around a little bit into the literature, and I didn't find a whole lot that focused on the social impacts of, for example, the July 2010 Enbridge pipeline disaster in Kalamazoo, or the Prairie River disaster that took place back in, I believe it was 1991. What you're seeing over on the right is just a screenshot of reported spills in your region, and there are thousands of them from just last year. These are not necessarily verified at this point, but again, this is just a sampling of what I found as I was looking around. So it's really difficult for those who've not experienced an environmental disaster to fully understand what communities that have done so are going through. Research has shown that renewable resource communities are especially susceptible to the adverse effects of toxic contamination events like oil spills because they depend on renewable natural resources for their social, cultural, and economic existences. Although stress might not be community-wide, certain groups, such as commercial and subsistence fishermen, as well as those who rely on tourism and recreation, are more likely to experience stress. There are numerous social issues associated with technological hazards and disasters. Again, these are based on decades of social science research. This is not anything new. And these issues that I'm about to share with you regarding, generally speaking, technological hazards and disasters translate entirely over into marine oil spills as we have studied over the past 3 or 4 decades. In spills that we've studied so far, we have found overall pervasive uncertainty associated with the events that cause social disruption in communities where these events happen. There are contested interpretations of the event. How much oil has been spilled, for example? We usually get conflicting messages about that. What will be the short and long-term effects of the oil on the natural environment and on people and on communities? What cleanup approaches are most safe and the best? We experience what we see as a loss of control rather than a lack of control. Loss of control is the feeling that something that we had control over, such as the technology that is carrying the oil, was within our power, and yet somehow it was beyond our control to prevent these kinds of activities. We have government agencies saying one thing, responsible parties are saying another, and those with local knowledge have different interpretations of what is going on and the extent of damage associated with these events. We also have cleanup activities that add to the mix of the confusion that can be caused in the wake of an oil spill. We have social vulnerability to environmental hazards, which involves people who, again, are more reliant on these renewable natural resources for their culture and their livelihoods. We have what is called the development of corrosive communities, which is the disruption of interpersonal and group relationships. We have boom and bust cycles associated with typically cleanup activities, where we experience what can be called a money spill, with people from outside communities coming into communities to work on cleanup, which cause additional social disruption when you have that influx of folks that aren't based in the community originally. There are community ties to the natural environment that can be disrupted. Those ties are critical to community efforts to maintain their ways of life. And we see too invisible trauma to the natural and social environments. So in many cases, the trauma to the natural environment isn't necessarily visible to the naked eye. And so it takes a lot of physical science to uncover that. And sometimes that can be difficult to translate into layperson's terms. We see secondary trauma associated with the bureaucratic processes, including claims and settlement and litigation processes. The litigation, for example, with the Exxon Valdez oil spill went on for 2 decades before it was settled in the Supreme Court here in the United States. We also often see long-term adverse health outcomes as a result of exposure to toxic contamination. And because there's so much uncertainty, we often have a lack of closure in these events, and there are chronic community impacts. So for example, in the oil spill that took place in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, that I mentioned earlier. In 1991, there were protests in 2021 related to the longer term impacts of that spill on communities there. So what we see is the idea that recovery for these communities becomes elusive. I'll leave this with you. This is a good resource to look at the psychological, physical health effects, economic impacts, social impacts, and cultural effects of oil spills. And this will be available, as I mentioned, in the slides that I'll leave with Kelsey. There are a number of predictors of stress associated with marine oil spills. We have concerns about family health and economic future, economic loss directly as a result of oil spills. We again have connections to renewable resources, and if those are strong, we have a lot more stress among those populations. People who are more directly exposed to the oil, particularly those who are involved with cleanup activities, seem to have more stress. And being involved with compensation processes is also very stressful, not just to those who are directly involved with compensation processes, but to the community at large, even if you're not involved in those processes. I will leave it there so that we have time for question and discussion about all the presentations. I'm available a little bit longer after we wrap up here, and I'm also available at the email address that you see there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ritchie. We do have just a few minutes for some Q&A, and the panelists have been really busy answering questions already, but please do keep entering your questions into the Q&A. We will, after the webinar has concluded, be sharing a Word document that has kind of all the Q&A that has been answered via typing rather than live. I think that what I would like to do is just find one question and ask that all the panel members kind of speak to it really quickly. And so I'm going to kind of rephrase a question that we received in the Q&A about whether or not, so the question is whether anyone can speak to potential long-term environmental impacts from an oil spill. For instance, has the Kalamazoo River in Marshall, Michigan been used as a case study on long-term environmental and biological impacts? And I would add to that, Dr. Murray has already typed an answer in the chat, but I would like him to maybe verbally speak, but then I would also add to that Dr. Graziano and Dr. Ritchie's opinions on economic and social impacts of oil spills. So take it away, Dr. Murray. Again, you answered it written, but we'd like to hear from you too.
Sure. And that actually, it's a great question. I'm more aware of the longer term impacts that have been assessed for some marine spills, as was touched on earlier, Exxon Valdez and even Deepwater Horizon, more recent, but already we're seeing studies that are looking at impacts still, a decade after that spill. So with the Kalamazoo River spill, we're over a decade out. You would think that we, might be seeing impacts. I'm not clear on how much of that research is going on now, and I think more could be. And looking at the little bit of the literature, it appears that there's been a fair amount of follow-up work on this spill, but I think a lot of it's been more like modeling related, modeling how the oil moved after the spill, how it, especially again, like I talked about, how the oil started out already a little bit denser than say some of the other lighter oils we would see in an oil spill, but then with the weathering, could get even yet more dense and then sink. So you have a lot of sinking, and that I think that complicated the response, but also from my perspective, it would likely present more risks going out into the future, in the sense that the oil gets more submerged, doesn't break down as readily, and so you have the potential for it to continue to kind of leach back into the water column and cause problems for aquatic life in that area. So I'm not sure to the extent that kind of research has been going on recently. I think it should. We definitely need more of that. One of the challenges when you have actual spills, then you can do this type of research. Absent those, then you have to work from model studies, studies in the lab, that kind of thing. So it's fortunate that we don't have more of these major spills, but I think that it's still worth doing more work just on that Kalamazoo, that area, to see if we're still seeing any residual impacts from that spill.
And Dr. Graziano, in terms of economic impacts of oil spills, are you aware of any research or whether the Kalamazoo River incident has been a case study for future occurrences?
Yes, thank you very much. And echo what Dr. Murray said. And also on the economic front, we have multiple ways of transmitting these disasters through to the economy. So certainly there are health effects for which I'm not fully aware of full studies that look at the economic impacts of those health effects. We know that the cleanup is still being recorded in balance sheets of the parties responsible, and we don't know exactly when that will finish. So that would still accruing every year. There is more money devoted to cleanup, restoration, reparation, cleanup, restoration, and reparation. Originally, I think was billed at something around $250 million. We're way past the $1 billion mark. Finally, there are effects from a regional perspective on what has happened to that region. For that, at least as of a couple of years ago, there were no studies that looked at that in terms of the effect on branding, effect on the housing market, and so forth, because of course nobody wants to live in an area that is perceived as being affected by an oil spill or any other negative spill in terms of hazardous material. Let me say also on the Enbridge spill, that is something we actually teach here at Southern in communication classes, because it's been fantastically handled in terms of communication. If you ask most American people if they heard of it, the answer is no, but they heard of the Deepwater Horizon spill. That's because the PR of the companies involved, the PR offices, did a wonderful job on their perspective. Whether or not it's a wonderful job for the people of Kalamazoo, that's a different story. But since Deepwater Horizon was brought up previously, there is even a blockbuster movie about it, whereas Kalamazoo is this sort of unknown place unless you are from Michigan or you do what we do for a living. So, and that's my answer, I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graziano. And Dr. Ritchie did offer to stay a little bit after, so I'll just have you comment on this social implications. And you mentioned in your presentation, Dr. Ritchie, that there isn't much research done within the Great Lakes Basin on social dimensions. But what lessons can we apply to things like this Kalamazoo River oil spill that happened?
So someone, Brian Wheeler, in the comments, I don't know if others can see my response, but it's a really important example that he provides about the Lac-Mégantic derailment in 2013 and other derailments that have happened up in Canada. And my colleagues there have done an excellent job of documenting the impacts there. I think one of the things that we need to do is conduct more effective social impact assessment work associated with development activities so that we can use the lessons that we've observed. And I say observed rather than learned, because there are many times then we could have done more prevention, particularly with respect to Deepwater Horizon in terms of the mental health impacts associated with that event on communities in the Gulf region. So if we anticipate the things that we know are very likely to emerge as the things that I listed, then we can prepare our social infrastructure for those as we do our transportation infrastructure for those. I think also, just as we talk about doing sensitivity analyses for the environment, we can do similar things for communities that have these kinds of transportation running through them. One of the things that my colleague Dwayne Gill and I have been looking at have been the possibility of a community oil spill vulnerability index that would focus on the social things associated with that. And I think too that some of these smaller spill events that go unnoticed for the most part could provide examples of things that we could do, such as developing memorandums of understanding between communities about how to respond to the social aspects of the outcomes of these kinds of events. So those are just a few things that I have considered in preparation for this discussion.
I'm
Kelsey.
muted. Thank you, Dr. Ritchie. And I was just saying, I think that Dr. Graziano has his hand up, and we'll hear from you quickly, Dr. Graziano, and wrap up. You're also muted.
Building on what Dr. Ritchie said very briefly, it's certainly there are always risks in transporting oil, and we will have to have better infrastructure for doing so, for managing them, if we want to continue to transport oil, of course. And what I must say is that we can also look at the other side. What are the benefits of creating that social infrastructure Dr. Ritchie was talking about? We did some preliminary studies with the University of Michigan a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, on the benefits, economic and from an institutional perspective of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, for example. And we found that in that case, there were enormous benefits to the communities that have benefited from that restoration program. Now, granted, that program looks at more historic pollution that comes from way in the past, but it shows us that those communities that use the restoration money well, first of all, they use the money well, and they enormously benefited, not just from an economic perspective, also social one, building a sense of place, building a sense of community, also a sense of pride. Michigan, Muskegon, or Duluth in Minnesota are prime examples for that. Just an example in Muskegon is relatively infamous because at the beginning of the 2000s, the first chunk of money for regional economic development they built a Holiday Inn downtown. The hotel was facing away from the water because the water was so bad. So the premium rooms would be facing away from the water. Nowadays, Muskegon has completed projects for urban housing for people working in Grand Rapids. It's attracting population and so forth, thanks to the cleanup that happened.
Thank you so much. To all the panelists, I want to sincerely thank all four of you for your really insightful presentations today and for doing such a thorough job answering questions in a multitude of different ways. And thank you to the webinar participants. Please join us in July for the next installment of our 2022 webinar series. So that's Wednesday, July 20th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern. And that will be focused on tribal policy and treaty law. Thank you all again. Really appreciate all of you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.